Good morning. You're listening to Central Wisconsin's 24-hour information station, AM 1320 WFHR. It's time now for the Morning Magazine, brought to you by Comfort Air Heating, Cooling, Plumbing.
And welcome, everybody, to Morning Magazine for this August 26th, 2020. Have your host, James J. Malouf here. In part two today, we're going to speak with Emily Marino and Pam Ross from the ODC. Right now, we have in with us our friends from Wisconsin Rapids Community Media. I want to say hi to Kevin. And, of course, our guest today is Lance Pliml, chairman of the Wood County Board. Good morning, Lance.
Good morning, James. Thanks for having me in this morning.
Good to have you. Good to see you. How are you and yours doing?
Everybody's good. We're facing some of the same issues everybody else is. You get a little stir crazy, not because you're not out of the house, but just the lack of events that you're able to attend within the community. But all in all, family's good.
Good. Very good to hear. Very good to hear. So let's make you work a little bit now. Yeah. No, not really. I wanted to kind of just take the conversation wherever you really wanted to go, but we do have a lot of things that we can touch on here. First up, just rewinding a little bit, you guys had a meeting earlier this last week, I believe. How did that go?
Pretty good. No, it went real well. Typical county board meeting, we meet the third Tuesday of every month with the exception of November, which is a second Tuesday, which is a mandated budget meeting. Typically most of the work gets done in committees. Once we get to the board, usually for most issues, everything is, fairly well laid out. And I don't want to say, pre-decided, but, by that time, people pretty much know where they're going on issues. This one dealt with the biggest issue on the agenda that day was the bonding that we do on an annual basis for capital improvements. Most of it related to highway improvements, and we made the commitment, I don't know, it always seems like 2 years ago. It's probably been 5 or 6 years ago to bond some of those projects to bring our roads up to a better standard than you're seeing in other places around the state. And we allocate about in the neighborhood of $2.5 million a year to that. I think it's 2.3 this year. And we've been able to improve those at a much more rapid rate than we thought we would. It's easier to fix than to replace. It costs about $500,000 a mile just to do a simple road out there. So if we can fix them ahead of time, that's beneficial. The rest of that money allocated generally to improvements at our Edgewater Haven Nursing Home up at the facility, the North Wood County Annex, known to most of you as Norwood, that facility. Other than that, there's a grant out there for some additional traffic enforcement, but that's money in, money out. But you have to have a vote to accept it, which always seems kind of crazy to me because who's going to say no?
Yeah.
But other than that, pretty much moving along. The one meeting we did have prior to that, that I don't know anybody touched on is, we've had an issue countywide with the number of inmates that we house in our local jail. And we've exceeded those, I'll call them state allowable limits for quite some time. And we've been able to manage that population using electronic monitoring, some other alternatives to incarceration. But, we've reached the point pretty soon where something needs to be done. And we have signed long-term contracts with a number of counties. But my concern is as they run out of room, what do we do and how do we prepare for the future? So, one of the options always is to build additional space, but it's extremely costly. It's a burden to the taxpayer. And, you hate to build capacity that you may not need in the future due to changes in whether it be sentencing laws or just a reduction in the number of people incarcerated. If you can ship them out to other counties at a reasonable rate, that makes a lot of sense. And then our local judges, our sheriff's department, and all people involved have been much more amenable to the use of electronic monitoring. And we've slowly adapted that as we see what works. Who's going to reoffend? Who's going to be a problem within the community? But as we've been able to fine tune that, that has decreased that population. But that's that's the giant hurdle that that 10,000 pound gorilla in the room, so to speak. Right. When you're looking at $50 to $60 million, let's say, to construct a new jail facility, and that would be a tremendous impact to the taxpayers.
One of the things, it's interesting you bring this up because when I've been talking, I feel like I've been talking with Sheriff Becker every month for about a month now. And one of the things that has come up on air, off air is the argument of a new jail and the reasons behind it. And certainly what you said about population and, shipping inmates out, we bring some in too. So that part of it. But one of the things of it that comes up out of this conversation every time we talk that stands out to me is the safety of our people doing these jobs, whether it is our officers or it's the people, keeping an eye on inmates and that sort of thing. So making a new facility would be much more safer, much more modern and everything. It all sounds good, but then, as you mentioned, there is the price tag, and that is something that nobody really can, bat an eye at. I mean, that is not easy for any community to handle, let alone our community, because that's something else that comes up as well, not just with him, but with everybody I talked to, especially with our mayor last week, was part of being blunt about it. Part of the reason he was brought in is to bring that debt down, and his history with numbers and all this stuff and everything. So adding something like that onto the table seems like a heavy thing to ask. But as far as for you in the board and everything, and I'm not asking you to give me a certain detailed opinions or anything, but from the gathering you get from the board and stuff, how do they feel about this subject? Is this something that is talked about a lot, or is it something that, well, this isn't going to happen anytime soon?
I think it's a real serious discussion, and you touched on some of the issues. Some of it is simple financial issues. It costs X amount of dollars to build a thing, and it's expensive, and that's obviously important. There's the operational cost with the bigger facility, which most people don't think about in some respects. But then there's the safety aspect, and not just the safety for those correction officers, which first of all are hard to recruit and hard to retain, but there's also the protection for the person incarcerated. Right. Most people don't feel necessarily sorry for somebody if they got themselves into a situation and they're in jail, but I think there's a responsibility of the agency or the county to make sure that they're protected from other inmates and from any danger that could occur to them in the facility. And the newer facilities have different construction principles than the old ones did. Better ways to view prisoners, better ways to house them. And there's a cost associated there with not doing anything, significant costs. And it can be staffing costs. It can be costs related to medical care and other things. So this isn't a simple, we build it and it costs X number of dollars and it's done. It's operationally, where do you go? The hard part, where I wish I had a crystal ball, is for years and years, our jail population stayed steady in the 150 to 170 person range. And all of a sudden it hits 250 plus in a very short amount of time. And so you go, well, what do you relate that to? Well, the heroin epidemic, the meth epidemic. But I've seen those, ebb and flow over the years too. I remember when we had a cocaine epidemic, so to speak. Or, if I go back into my days in, living in Chicago as a kid, you had LSD was a big problem, as well as heroin and some of the other stuff. Those things come and go. And the last thing you want to do is build, a jail that houses 300 inmates, for instance, and then find out you only need 150. It gets further complicated in a conversation a few months ago with the governor and with the Secretary of the Department of Corrections, Kevin Carr, and he said the goal of the state was to reduce the number incarcerated by 40%. Well, if you reduce the number incarcerated by 40%, I would assume that frees up a lot of state capacity, and then can counties use it? So the ironic part of this, and when I say funny, I don't necessarily mean you're laughing, but
we know what
the
you
funny
mean,
part of this is whether it be Portage County, Marathon County, those surrounding counties, as we meet as county board chairs or as county boards, we kind of chuckle a bit, go, who's going to flinch first and spend the money because we'll use your additional capacity. That being said, this is a serious conversation, and there's a lot of moving parts. One thing I praise the Sheriff's Department for, the Public Safety Committee, is they haven't gone in here with any preconceived notions. It's what would we have to build? Where would we build it? What would the cost be, both for the facility operationally, and then in the areas of mental health and the well-being of employees and those incarcerated, and where do we go? So it's going to be a huge decision.
Yeah.
When we get there.
When it comes to the inmates themselves and their safety and their well-being and all that stuff, I understand that it's very easy for most people to just kind of scoff that off and everything. Well, you did a crime, you deserve. Absolutely. You do a crime, you have to do time. But a society is judged by how they treat people like that, like inmates, like our elderly, all these different groups, and they're one of them. And how much better are you of the criminal if you're treating them just as badly as they treat society? I mean, you can't have this. This isn't one of those things where you can just kind of like wash that away. Well, they did this. Look, I'm all in favor of people doing their time. We have to have, accountability in life. But there's also a line there of we don't throw them in a pig pen. I mean, certain things. So as far as just kind of tossing that to the side, that is not one of those top parts of this subject that can be taken lightly. At the same time, all the things that you mentioned there weigh so heavy as far as the cost and these sorts of things. So it cannot be an easy thing to balance. And I appreciate so much you kind of giving us a behind the curtain look there of what's going on with that subject. Because when the only time we've really gotten a chance to talk about this on the air is with Sheriff Becker. And he feels kind of guilty bringing it up because it feels like if I'm having a birthday and I want to have a birthday party and I'm asking everybody to celebrate my birthday and hey, throw a surprise party for me or something. He can't do that. I mean, he feels a little like that about it. I appreciate you bringing this up and kind of bringing it to us here because there are details about this I don't think we really understood or knew.
It seems like yesterday, but we built a jail in the 80s, and you go, oh, that's 40 years ago. Things change, technology changes. One of the big issues is segregation within the jail. And like you said, people do things that get them arrested and do dumb things. But, the last thing I want to see is I'll call it a violent offender who becomes, is arrested and incarcerated. It might be pre-trial. Right. And then we have somebody who, again, I'm not defending this in any way whatsoever. Somebody who's picked up, for non-payment of child support or for a local disorderly conduct because they got in an argument downtown at night or, even a drunk driving. I'm not minimizing drunk driving. And they get thrown in a cell with somebody and something physical occurs. Right. That's a concern. I think there's a reason that we have to have safety for those correctional officers, but we also have to have safety for those people that we incarcerate in those short periods of time. Yeah. And all of that factors in, as well as, the health care, the mental health aspects there. Do we have the facilities to educate people so when they go out, it's just not that revolving door? And, it's easy to say it's not a societal problem to worry about that or the taxpayer. But when you sit in a chair like I do or the board, you look at it and you say, but there is a cost. There's an ongoing cost. I keep rearresting. I have the cost of putting them in there, but I also have a societal cost. The kids that aren't getting parental supervision, the generational problems we have. If I go look in that jail, frankly, sometimes I look at the names. I go, oh, yeah, I remember their dad was in here and their grandpa was in here and their brother's in here. Those are things we need to try to break that cycle, and we can do that through education and some of those other opportunities.
Yeah. One of the proudest things that I feel in this area that's going on is the sheriff we have in charge right now, and that's something he gets. Stopping this revolving door of people and the mental health aspect of that, of stopping that and everything. It's not enough we've learned that pointing your finger at somebody and shaming them or discouraging or, whatever is not going to work. It's going to take a lot more than that. And that dives into the mental health aspect of this and everything. Again, a great thing to touch on there by you, I think.
And people don't realize how closely allied, human services is with the programs they run. Mm-hmm. Most of the people that we have in those jails participate in they've been identified somewhere along the road on some issue. Now, that being said, it's the flip side of this. Over and over and over in every community, when we do surveys and say, what's the most important issue to you? And this is extremely important today as this has reared its ugly head across the country. Number one, every time, is public safety. If you ask people, they say the number one thing I want to be assured of is when I leave my house, whether it's to go to work, school, the park, wherever I go, I want to feel secure. And public safety is the number one issue. There are some bad people that need to be behind bars forever in some cases. Mm-hmm. And you've seen this, I don't want to call it protesting, but you've seen rioting in places and you've seen vandalism. You've seen people, you've seen them publicly assaulted on TV just walking by a group. Well, we have a sheriff that understands that, and we have a district attorney. We have people in our area that go, that's one of our big concerns. Yeah. And we're going to address it. We're going to address it seriously. You can go out and speak all you want. You can congregate, but you can't break stuff.
There's a huge difference of protesting and rioting. It's a big difference.
It's a big difference. And, one of the ones I had a conversation with somebody recently, and they said, well, the person driving down the road almost hit us. I said, well, what were you doing in the road? I said, was the person driving on the sidewalk? No, but we have a right to march down the middle of the road. Well, not really. If you get a permit, and they close the road you have a right to do that. Now, I'm not encouraging people to go out and
No, but I
physically attack people.
I think it's also a good side note for people that go on their walks when there's a sidewalk right there, but they walk on the street. Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like it could be the argument could be made for a couple of subjects.
You know, you can't block roads. You can't disrupt commerce. You can't destroy businesses and the opportunity. And so, public safety is number one. And, and then that morphs into the other stuff. And by the way, James and I don't have a script when we come in here. I mean, we're winging it.
I love that about talking to you, Lance.
From the time we start.
Yes.
But and that comes, down to one of the other ones that everybody's touched on recently is the COVID issue. And in the, the personal right, the right of a business to either require masks, not to require masks, to enforce or not to enforce. The one thing I guess I want to touch on is that's why I like regional control. If you live in a high-rise apartment in Manhattan and everybody has to get on an elevator because there's 2,000 people in the building, that's an issue. If you're out in Wyoming and you're riding the range on your horse, you probably don't need a mask. So when I hear people say we need a national masking policy, I find that kind of absurd because it doesn't apply place to place. Now, in our own county, and I'll just touch on this, the one thing that also frustrates me is when I see this rolling odometer of how many cases we've had. I guess from my perspective, so what? I mean, that's how many we had. If I talked about how many people have had influenza since the time it was first diagnosed, it's in the hundreds of millions. That odometer will keep rolling. The one that's important for me is how many active cases we have, how many people are hospitalized, and how many deaths do we have. Now, just to give you some assurance in Wood County, a little different than others, the number of people that have the percentage of active cases right now, and listen to the zeros, is 0.0005% of the population has a currently active case. So the chances of running into somebody, even coming in contact with somebody who's tested positive, is 1 in a little over 1,800. Now, that being said, that's pretty minimal, but that doesn't mean don't be smart. That doesn't mean put your mask on if you're in a tight environment. Try to practice social distancing. If there's a business, a household that requires it, comply. If you have a family member that's compromised, probably a really good idea to wear a mask. I hear people say, you're not safer if. Well, you're safer, maybe not, exponentially safer, but you're safer. So use your judgment, but I wouldn't be fearful in our current environment.
Do you think that part of the reason the Will County Health Department or the CDC released the amount of cases, that active number that you talked about there, is in part because people want that information? There is so much misinformation out there right now. I literally every day have to handle this and deal with this. People with these conspiracy theories or these, weird things that they read on QAnon or whatever and everything, and coming at me with these things. And the more correct information that our public health officials can get out there, the better. Certainly, I understand what you're saying as far as that. Well, we don't want to create panic. We don't want to create these kind of things or anything like that. But at the same time, you have to balance that with getting actual facts out there for people. The more facts they have, the more comfortable most people feel. And on a subject where we're still figuring out what those facts are. We're dealing with something that those of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s and that kind of thing knew what HIV was like. We remember what it was like when there was a point in time where we thought we couldn't be in the same room with somebody with HIV. And now we know, of course, better than that. This is a similar thing where we are learning as we're going along. Well, what causes this? What is, those sorts of questions that we all have.
And what treats it, and that's why I look at active cases. Like I said, that odometer will roll forever. I mean, at some point, you're going to be in the tens of millions of people who've been exposed.
Completely agree.
But if I went back and I looked at some statistics the other day, and I don't want to state them because I don't remember them exactly, but you just generally, the number of deaths from influenza in the first few years of treating influenza was unbelievable because we didn't know how to treat, the disease. We're obviously seeing the outcomes much better right now with COVID than we did at the start because we're starting to come up with some treatment. Some of the drugs we're using are effective. Even the convalescent plasma, which they're using, obviously has had a positive effect. So as we learn more, we're going to get better at this. And the number of deaths is going to decrease. The severity probably decreases because we treat, intermittently as they start to show symptoms. And you're right, sorting through the politicized numbers gets extremely difficult. And that's why I said I don't like to even state state numbers. The ones I know I get from my local health department, I've verified those. I've looked at those. I know that, as of today, we've had, like 421 total cases in Wood County. And we've had, like I said, about 41 active today,
Right.
which is an unbelievably small percentage of the population. Again, not to minimize. That being said, if you're in one of those high-risk groups and you happen to be exposed and you happen to be symptomatic, it can be devastating. So, like I said, I urge caution, but I'm not fearful. And you need to respect those businesses that ask and require. And by the same token, I'm not upset if somebody doesn't. The safer you are, the better off you may be personally. But use your judgment and be responsible for your own health.
I think that a point that you made earlier is one that I think that a lot of us can get behind, where we would love to have some overall structure to this, or some overall kind of like, way to direct ourselves, or rules or whatever. We don't have a lot of. We really, when it comes right down to it, don't have too many national laws. Most laws are state by state or county by county, that kind of thing, judging on the area. They're not worrying about fishing laws in certain parts of the country and everything, because they don't have anywhere to fish, things like that. So it makes sense that there wouldn't be a national fishing law or something like that. So I certainly see your point there, and I think that that's one of those things that's important. How important is it for the people making those decisions to have correct information then? And to be up to date, to be researching this stuff and be doing their homework.
Yeah, local knowledge is king. And I made the comment I'm sure it was on your show many months ago. It's probably back in, April. If there had been a pandemic outbreak of COVID in Montana, Manhattan would have not shut down.
Right.
It's that simple. Because, local response is better. And the part I get the biggest kick out of, and I've served in a government capacity, elected capacity for, a quarter of a century, basically. If national policy gets enacted, every governor goes, you can't tell me what to do. Regardless of party, I don't care who it is. True. I've gone through every administration for the last, as long as I've lived, but involved for the last 25 years. That's the reaction of every governor until they have a problem. Then the first thing they do is scream and go, the federal government hasn't done anything. Well, I got news for you. I sat in the room when you said, they're not telling me what to do.
Right.
And now you want them to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
So, I prefer local control. I think that makes sense. And, so you go from local control to a little bit of a regional perspective, because obviously what happens in Wood County probably happens in Portage County.
Sure.
So you like to make sure that those health officials are talking to each other and making sure that happens. So,
speaking of that, do you talk to board members in other counties?
I do. I've had the honor of serving as the president of the Counties Association for a long time.
I thought so, but I didn't want to say it because I didn't know if you still were.
And I am. And so, I meet with board members in our different committees across the state, our steering committees. But I also, on a fairly regular basis, meet with our WCA, Wisconsin County Association Board of Directors, and a number of the chairmen. So we have those conversations. It's daily. I've had 2 already today, probably have a couple more as we go on. And it's a sharing of information. What are you doing in your county? How do we make it better? How do we open the economy? And by the way, that's one that's been, I just have to, applaud the residents of our county. We assumed going into this that our sales tax revenues might be down 20 to 25% as we started, on this COVID venture. Our sales tax revenues right now, year over year, are up. Statewide, we're seeing about a 3% deviation from what they expected. And the ones that are down are in places you'd expect that. The Wisconsin Dells area, which affects Sauk, Columbia, some of those other counties. Door County, early, took a real hit with tourism. But we're seeing people shop at home, which we've encouraged here forever. You're probably seeing more online shopping, but those sales taxes, if collected, are allocated as such. So from that perspective, home ownership has gone up. Affordability of homes has gone up. So from a government perspective, we're in pretty good shape right now. And so I encourage you to get out there locally, to continue shopping, and we hope that continues.
We appreciate the time, Lance, and not only that, but everything you're doing in the community. You and I have to talk about your Chicago days one day.
Sure.
I didn't know that was a tie we had there. We had that in common and everything. We'll have to talk about that sometime. But always appreciate the open conversation that you and I can have and what you're doing in our community. Good to talk to you, and you and yours take care.
Well, I appreciate it. And it's our board that makes those decisions, not me personally. I just get to expound upon them. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and we appreciate that board. And we appreciate our friends over at Wisconsin Rapids Community Media being in today. We will be back with more Morning Magazine coming up on AM 1320 WFHR.